Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to begin. Again, I apologize for the delay. We were asked to move everything back by about a half hour to give everyone a chance to make it to their workshops. My name is Father Nathaniel Simeonidis. I know the program says that this is a workshop under the auspices of the Office of Inter-Orthodox Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations, but it's actually a workshop of the Archdiocesan Committee on Science and Technology, the AACST, as it's called. This committee was formed about 15 years ago by His Eminence the Archbishop, and it was formed to try to offer our people information to inform the Synod on cutting-edge technologies and developments in the fields of science and technology, whenever necessary to respond to certain issues. And so we have a tradition every 2 years at the Clergy Laity Congresses to offer a workshop or a panel discussion. This year we decided to focus on something in the area of bioethics, and much has been said in the past about IVF or artificial in vitro fertilization or artificial means of conceiving a child, and we thought that it might be a good idea to focus on extending life. So this year we chose organ transplantation, organ donation. There are going to be 3 presenters today, 2 along with me. I just want to quickly introduce them. We have with us Father David Ayman. Father David is a priest at the Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church in Decatur, Illinois. He grew up as a Presbyterian in a Presbyterian home, and he was a human secularist, as he says himself, as he describes himself. His first encounter with the Orthodox Church was during a college visit back in the Soviet Union when it existed at the time. And after 9 years of struggling to avoid the inevitable, he was baptized at the Three Hierarchs Church in Champaign, Illinois, where he met his wife, Diana, and they had their first child. As he likes to explain it, it was then that the Holy Spirit made it very clear that he was to pursue the priesthood. That's when he had his calling. He graduated from our seminary, Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in 2008, and that same year he was ordained to the priesthood. Currently, his 3rd child is at St. Louis Children's Hospital, and that's where he's joining us from. She is waiting for a heart transplant. She is currently supported by cutting-edge technology to keep her alive and healthy until such time as a heart, an appropriate heart for her to receive is found. So, Father David, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
We also have with us Gail Wallachak. Gail is the Executive Secretary of the AACST, and I thank you, Gail, for all that you do, for helping us communicate and coordinate our efforts. Gail is a professor of radiation oncology, radiology, and cell and molecular biology in the Feinberg School of Medicine in Northwestern University. She has a BS in Biological Sciences from Youngstown State University and a PhD in Medical Sciences from the University of Toledo, from the Medical College of Ohio, that is. She did her postdoctoral work at the Mayo Clinic and then moved to Aragon National Laboratory in 2001. Her scientific interests are predominantly in the areas of molecular biology, radiation biology, and nanotechnology studies. So very cutting-edge things. She's authored a number of articles and papers. She also received her doctorate of ministry from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and is an associate director of the Zygon Center for Religion and Science, and an adjunct professor of religion and sciences at Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. So, Gail, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So what we're going to do is I asked you all for your patience with our technology here today. We were going to try to have everyone present, but because of their professional commitments and issues related back in the hospital. They couldn't make it. So, Gail, if you would start off with your presentation to talk to us about what organ donation is, transplantation, what it is, what it means, and then I'll come in and talk about a little bit about brain death and how and from where we procure some of the organs. And then lastly, we'll give enough time to Father David to talk to us about his experience as a father and a priest, struggling with a lot of these issues that many of us are not aware of. Maybe he'll give us some greater insight into what goes on in a family and in the mind of a priest. So Gail, let me share your document with everyone.
Great.
Okay. So Gail, you're all ready.
Okay, I can't see it though.
So we're on the first slide.
Is it sharing screen? There it is. Got it.
Okay.
Okay, great. And people can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so look, the goal of this is to just give some sort of general overview into transplantation and where it's coming from. So let me start with talking about what is transplantation. It's where an organ is actually moved from one body who's considered the donor into another person who's the recipient. And the general goal of it is to replace a damaged organ or an organ that is absent or an organ that is not functioning properly anymore. The usual organs that we transplant would be things like heart, kidney, liver, lungs, pancreas, intestine, and thymus. And it should be noted that there's a difference between organs that are transplanted and bones that are and tissues that are transplanted, things like bones where people will get sometimes a graft in their jaw to be able to allow them to have an implant put in. Tendons, corneas are often transplanted. There are skin transplants, heart valves are put in, and often those heart valves are even from other species like pigs. Nerves, veins, bone marrow, hair are all transplanted, but those are not organs, those are tissues. And so it's much easier to transplant a tissue because you don't often have to worry about complications that might come up. The most common organ that is transplanted and that we have the greatest history for is kidneys. And in fact, when I was a student, I worked in a kidney transplant lab, and our main job was to try to come up with people that would be good donors and good matches for kidney transplants. Next slide. And this is just a diagram to show how it's done. The advantage of things like kidneys and liver is that in the goal of trying to transplant, you often can use a living donor. So for instance, most people can have 2 functioning kidneys. You can survive pretty well with 1. So there are examples, I even know of some, where a sister has donated her kidney for her brother. She lives with 1 kidney, he lives with 1 kidney, and they go on perfectly fine. Or another example is liver, where a person can live without part of their liver. The liver regenerates really well. So you can actually take a piece of a person's liver and put it into a donor. And in those examples, these are from living donors. That's not the majority of most transplants that take place today, though. Most often we're dealing with people and with donations that are coming from people that have not survived. And so therefore we're dealing with what we call, quote, cadaver donors. Next slide. Next slide.
It is.
Is it moving?
Yeah.
So I can't see the next slide, Father?
It's set, Gail. It's set.
Is it up?
Yes.
Okay, there it is. Okay, so who can donate or... Okay, I can see it now. Great, thank you. So again, as I noted, for kidneys or livers, you can actually have a living donor, but otherwise you have to deal with people who are brain dead already. Father Nathaniel will talk about that a little bit. There are people who are dead that have a circulatory death where their heart is no longer able to function. And the general rule is that the organs must be harvested up to 24 hours after the heart has stopped beating. If you wait much longer than that, the organ will no longer be acceptable. So therefore, there are a lot of issues that go into organ donation, but one of them is how far is the organ from the person to be transplanted, because in those cases you have to worry about whether you can travel at the right distance or not. Most often they're brought in by helicopter, maybe first by plane. Next slide. So the process, the general steps are that first of all, the physician has to ensure that the person needs a transplant, that they've exhausted every other means of therapy, and that the only thing left is to go for a transplant. The next thing then is to be able to test what the issues are for the person, whether they'll be able to receive a transplant or not, whether they're eligible for a transplant. And there are many issues that make a person not eligible. For instance, if you've had a previous cancer in the past, or if you've had, or if you have some sort of addiction issues, or if you have certain kinds of diseases, you're no longer eligible to actually receive a transplant. Once you are considered to be eligible, you're put on a list. This is a national list that is available throughout the entire United States. We then test that list, try to match people. We check to see if their immune systems are going to be compatible. If their immune systems are compatible, then normally the physician who is in charge of the transplant team is notified that an acceptable donor is available. When the donor is accepted by the transplant team, then the transplant can take place. There are many reasons why a transplant team might not be able to accept the donor even if they're considered to be eligible. The organ might be too large, it might be damaged in some way. So there are many, many issues that go into this, and it's a very complicated process. Next slide. Among the things that are probably the most challenging is the immune response of the host. You do not want to put an organ, say a kidney, into a person and have them reject it, because that means that the kidney was not a good match for that person. You've wasted the kidney that you transplanted in, and you've actually wasted the chance for that person to have a good organ, because they're going to have a harder time accepting a second transplant if the first one failed. So how do we determine who's a good match? We test the blood from the person who is going to donate and from the person who is the recipient. And if the blood proteins are similar, they normally test for ABO, the standard blood match for that we use on our blood proteins. But then there are a series of immune proteins we also test for. And then in addition to that, we often can use drugs that will help suppress the immune system, that will allow for the transplant to take a little bit better. Next slide. So there's a very long history that's gone into transplants, and over the years, many of us have heard many of these stories, but I think the things we don't know are that it started very early. This first skin transplant that was recorded in the medical literature was done in the 1800s, and it was a skin transplant, it was a tissue transplant. Again, in early 1900s, another transplant, a corneal transplant, a tissue transplant. But finally, in 1930s, the first organ was transplanted, and it was a kidney that came from a cadaver from a person who had passed away, and this was done in Russia. Since then, there have been numerous developments to attempt to transplant things, and most notably, in the past few years, we've heard about face transplants that are being done for people that have severe damage to their face. And there was a double leg transplant that was done a number of years ago in Spain. So we're seeing the development of more and more technology that allows for more and more transplants to take place. Next slide. Carrel won the Nobel Prize for his work on organ transplants in 1912. He did a lot of work in animal systems first, but it led to some of the first kidney transplants that were done in Russia later on. Next slide. So if we jump sort of from what's the biology to now what are bioethical aspects of transplants, there are a huge number of questions that have come up over the years. There are a few that are that we've been struggling with for many years, and some that we've been struggling with only recently. There's the question of what is the definition of death? How do we know when somebody's actually dead? How can we say that the person would not be able to survive, and therefore we should take the organ from them? How do we obtain consent for organ donation? If the person is no longer able to answer for themselves, who actually answers for them? Do their parents, do their offspring, who actually says that this organ can be taken? Should there be charges for organ transplants? Right now in the US, we don't permit for there to be any costs for transplant, but there are some people that argue, in fact, that we should actually have some charges associated with it. Then there are people who, when they can't find an organ here in the US, or maybe they're not eligible for an organ here in the US, then they pay to go abroad, go to another country, and do tourism to try to obtain a better chance at a transplant. And finally, this has led to recent concerns, particularly in many Asian nations, about organ trafficking and how people are giving up a kidney in order to have it be transplanted. At the same time, they can get a lot of money for it and be able to sustain a family. There are some reports of that in India and China. Not all of them, most of them have not been confirmed, but probably there's some evidence that suggests that it's going on. All of these are ethical issues that need to be dealt with when we talk about transplants in a broad sense. Next slide. So what's been happening in recent years, though, is that as we look at the need for transplants and the number of available transplants, the waiting lists are growing larger and larger, and the number of organs is remaining about constant. And so we have greater people in need for transplants now, maybe more than ever. And so therefore, there's a big push to try to have people become donors, to have people consider listing on their driver's license that they are willing to be donors, to allow others to live because of the use of the transplant. Next slide. So the World Health Organization issued a number of ethical considerations that they list as being important. They said, first of all, no matter what happens in transplantation, we must make sure that we have respect for people as persons. There must be informed consent, and it must be voluntary. Now, again, that issue of informed consent becomes tricky because who's actually giving the consent? There is an option to veto. If the person decides at the last minute of their life that they don't want to do it, they have the option to veto it. And there must be good stewardship of the organs. In particular, in the United States, we've set up programs to allow for large networks to actually make sure that every single organ is used to its best ability and have little wastage as possible. There also must be no attempt at wanting to do harm here. So one way to do that is to have long-term follow-up of both the donors and the recipients. So in cases where there's a living donor, follow that person up for many years, ask the question, was there harm to them for their donation? And at the same time, look at the recipients and see, was this a valuable thing? Were there things we should have been thinking about that we weren't thinking about? And finally, the WHO says that there should be justice in this. We need to have fair criteria for identifying donors and selecting them. And there should be donation without any charges being made or any costs being made except for the general medical care of the individual in question. Next slide. Now, if you look at the religious attitudes about transplantation, it's actually very interesting. First of all, most Christian denominations have been known to support organ transplants predominantly as an act of love for others. So what people are saying is, most Christians are saying, look, if you love others, this is one way to show love toward others, is to help spare their life. Mormons accept organ transplants. Jehovah's Witnesses were an exception a number of years ago because they do not allow for blood transfusions. But in recent years, they've been modifying that view, saying that as long as the blood is removed from the organ, it is acceptable to have it be transplanted. And in fact, most blood has to be removed in order to have the transplant work well anyway. So it's very acceptable. Jewish scholars, most very Orthodox Jews have problems with it because they do not believe in interfering with the body after death. But other Jewish denominations have been supportive of it. Hindus have accepted it as being like a person who puts on new clothing. Buddhists have been accepting, and even Muslim scholars in recent years have become very accepting of it as a part of the importance of altruism and caring for others. Next slide. So what does our own Orthodox Church say about organ transplants? There are really no objections that exist. We do say that it's very important to make sure that respect is shown to the body. If we're dealing with cadaver transplants, we must take very good care of the body that is donating the organ as much as we do the person who's receiving it. No harm must be done to the donor, so the person must be legally, legitimately dead. And it must be that for the recipient, we've determined that there's no other way to save their life except through an organ transplant. But in general, the donation of an organ is seen as the greatest gift we can give to another. We're giving the gift of life to others. Next slide. Interestingly, the Church of Greece had, I think, a really good perspective on this. They say that a life-ending donation, so giving organs at the end of your life, is a self-sacrificing act of love. And they said, and they used the quote from 1 John by saying, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." But what the Church of Greece also said that was important is that it is a philanthropic duty toward the recipient, that it must be done, the donation of the organ must be done freely and with consent, and there must be an atmosphere of mutual love and communion. And again, this is not so in keeping with the bioethical attitudes that the World Health Organization stated either. So I think we're seeing this sort of general trend among all the different groups, and I think the Orthodox fit very well into this perspective. Next slide. The other issues, I think, I've mentioned a few of these, that the goal must be to save life and not just to experiment. So we don't want to be doing this because we want to test to see whether an organ transplant is going to work in this situation. We actually want to do it to save life. That's got to be the goal of it. Generally, the decision to donate an organ should be made in consultation with the spiritual father. The rights of the family and the patients must be kept in mind. And again, the final issue that Orthodox would state very strongly is that donation from an embryo would not be permitted at this point in time. And that's going to become important when I come to my last slide, where I'll mention some attempts for the future. Next slide. And I find it really interesting. It's kind of a cool story. We Orthodox venerate Saints Cosmas and Damian, the unmercenaries, who refused. There were identical twin brothers who lived around 287 AD, and they actually refused to ever take any money for their work. So they're called unmercenaries by the Church. And many of our groups, including OCAMPER, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion, have Saints Cosmas and Damian as patron saints. Well, what is really interesting is that there is a pious tradition of the Church that says that Saints Cosmas and Damian actually transplanted a leg from a Moor or a dark-colored person onto a person who was white, and the Moor was dead already, and they were able to restore life. Now, whether this is, or restore his leg back to normal, whether, this is a pious teaching of our Church, and it shows to what extent Cosmas and Damian were willing to go to try to help others and to care for others. So I think it's a very interesting story that exists in our tradition. And in fact, many of the Catholics who also revere Cosmas and Damian have icons of the transplantation of the leg that they use to show that their willingness to accept transplants. Next slide. And finally, I just want to end it up by mentioning a few things that I think we'll be seeing in the future. Right now, we deal with organ transplant by trying to exchange a sick organ for a healthy one. We're trying to put in a functional organ, but there is a huge amount of work, particularly in my own field of nanotechnology, that is aimed toward developing new tissue engineering approaches. There is artificial blood that's been generated already. There are artificial hearts that are being attempted. And oftentimes these are using cells from the individual themselves to try to grow a new organ. So I believe in the next probably 10 years, we're going to be seeing changes in this. There is also a lot of stem cell technology going on to try to generate new organs. I think that work might be more controversial. We've talked about that at previous Clergy Laity Congresses. I don't want to go into that in detail here, but I will mention that there is a lot of work being done in this area. And with that, I'll end and turn it over to Father Nathaniel.
Thank you, Gail. Give me 1 second. Okay. Thank you, Gail.
My pleasure.
So at this point, what I wanted to do is to just draw out some more details from something that Gail mentioned in her presentation. Gail spoke about living donors, donors who can donate tissue or organs to someone else, and continue on living. So, for example, blood, skin, a kidney, and so forth. We often, there might be people here today who have donated blood, most likely someone who maybe has donated a kidney. But for those organs that are the critical ones, like the heart, the lungs, the pancreas, the vital organs, those can only come from a donor who has already died, or a cadaver donor, as sometimes they're oftentimes referred to, because if you obviously remove a heart from someone, they would die. And the law does not permit someone to go into a hospital and say, I want to donate my heart to save my child. They will not do that. They will not kill someone to take their organ to give to someone else. So what does this mean? For some of the clergy in here, maybe you have been called to the hospital to visit someone who was in a tragedy, a tragic accident, and is on life support, a car accident, or a child or someone who has drowned and is maintained on life support. And let me just take a step back and talk about kind of what was going on prior to advances in technology and life-sustaining technologies. In the past, when somebody sustained a hit in the head, or when someone was found in a pool or in the ocean and they drowned, there was really no way to sustain them on any life support. There was nothing around. They would die eventually. As technology advanced and people were able to be connected to a ventilator and other devices, people were able to remain alive long after sustaining or after being in an accident. And physicians started to realize that there was a time when, there was a period of time when these patients were not coming back. They were so far gone. Their functions, their biological functioning, their brain would cease to a point that they kind of could not think of them as being in a comatose condition. And there is a term called comatose, coma de passe. In other words, beyond coma, beyond that point where someone could come back. And, and so doctors began to think of different ways of referring to these patients. And nowadays, they are often called brain dead patients. Patients whose brains have been determined to have suffered irreversible damage, and therefore, according to neurological criteria, doctors consider them dead. And again, the popular way of referring to these patients is brain dead. And there are kind of two schools of thought. When is someone considered dead according to neurological criteria, or when can we call someone brain dead? And the first school of thought is kind of the U.S. school of thought. In the U.S., for the most part, patients will be called or be determined to be dead, brain dead, when their entire brain ceases to function. So the entire brain needs to be necrotic, has to die. In the UK and in some other parts of the world, there is other criteria. It's called brain stem death. So in those areas, if the brain stem, which controls most of the life-sustaining functions, breathing, the heartbeat, and so forth, if that has died or is irreversibly necrotic, then the patient can be determined brain dead. And there are ways for testing this in the hospital. The first kind of test is that the patient has to have suffered some sort of acute catastrophic event. whether it's severe head injury, a car accident, drowning, cardiac arrest, something has to be there. Why are they in the hospital? Usually some acute catastrophic event needs to be present. That's the first test. The second test is kind of doctors need to go in and rule out reversible causes for their condition. So if a patient is in the bed and they're on life support, they're brought into the hospital, they're connected to a ventilator, and other measures are begun. Doctors will have to make sure that their condition is not caused by drug intoxication, maybe hypothermia, or some metabolic process that has gone out of whack. So if they can determine that that's not why a patient is in that condition, they can move on to further testing. And really, there's a clinical exam where the doctor will come in at the bedside and start testing for reflexes, a gag reflex, response to pain, response to the touch of the cornea, if they touch the eye, and so forth. And if they also continue not to show any responses, they can continue on and test for apnea. And apnea, basically how they test for that is the lack of breath. They would turn off the respirator for a certain amount of time and see if the patient would naturally begin to gasp for air. And that would be a process that's kind of natural. It's a process that comes from the brainstem. And if they would begin to breathe or try to breathe, that's a sign that they don't pass the neurological criteria of determining death. And lastly, in the US or in any place where they need to confirm the necrosis of the entire brain, they could perform other tests like an EEG or is it an angiogram, where they test the blood flow in the brain. And if they see that there is no flow of blood or if there are no pulses, electrical pulses, again, that confirms that the patient is dead. So that's what doctors do. And for the most part, the church and our tradition, if we look at the patristic writing for the past 2,000 years, I mean, very little has been said about the brain or the importance of the brain. The brain and, the centrality of the brain is something very new. I mean, with cognitive science, with brain science, we realize more and more the central role of the brain. The fathers of the church don't focus on the brain so much. They talk about life and death. They talk about the soul. They do talk about the separation of the soul and the body when death occurs as a violent act in the process of dying. They also are quite practical in many ways. St. John Chrysostom, for example, he recognizes that the most significant organ in one's body is the heart. Okay? He does this and he says, when the heart stops, or if it's injured, life ceases. So the fathers knew that biological function is connected to life. It's not a process, it's connected to the unity of the person. Saint Athanasius, when he was asked about where does the soul rest? Is it in a particular organ, as some of the Jews were claiming? Is it in the liver? Is it in the kidneys? Is it in the blood? Is it in the lungs? Saint Athanasius was quite careful in how he responded, because he knew if he said that the soul rested in one particular part of the body, then someone would say, well, then how is the rest of the body alive? How is the person alive if it's only in one's hand or in the liver? On the other hand, he was careful not to say that it's in all the body, that it's everywhere, because then someone could ask him, what happens if you cut off someone's hand? What if it's amputated or a foot is amputated? Does that mean the soul is amputated? And so what St. Athanasius says, and it's quite amazing, he speaks about the soul in the following way, and I just want to quote this because I cannot say this better myself. He says, as the rays of the sun have a single source and enter a house, illuminating everything in the house, in this fashion, the soul, dwelling in 3 areas of the body, illumines the entire body. The soul dwells in the heart, in the rear section of the head, and in the principal arteries. Therefore, whenever the head, heart, or arteries are injured, the bond between the soul and the body is severed, and the body remains dead. What's interesting about this is, again, he doesn't say they rest, the soul rests in one place, but that the soul moves the entire body, that the soul is everywhere. But yet he's also aware that these functions, that these organs are so critical to the maintenance of life that he will say that they enter, or they have their dwelling in these three areas. And he says the heart, the head, and major arteries. And it's interesting because in all three cases, we could talk about cardiac arrest and brain death. Okay? And in closing, I just wanted to say, many times people will turn to the church and ask us, or ask the priest, is this person dead? Is the doctor correct? Come in and say something, because the doctors are saying that my child is dead, but he is breathing, or she's breathing. I can see the machine, even though he's breathing. I know he's alive. I know he can hear me, or she can hear me. And I would say that the primary job of the priest is not to determine when death occurs. That's not what we do. We don't go into a hospital. We would never go into a hospital and second guess a doctor, ever. We would never go into a hospital and perform a trisalion service unless the doctors tell us the person has died. We would never do. We would never go in there and say, you're wrong, so we're not going to perform a trisalion, or he is dead, so I'm performing a trisalion. So our job as pastors, I would say, is not to go in and second guess priests, but to guide our flock, to teach them about a greater meaning of life and death, to help them understand what it means to have life in the tomb. We chant it every Holy Friday, life in the tomb. What does that mean? And what does it mean for Adam and Eve to have died after disobeying God, after turning their back on God, and yet still having biological function and still moving? So that, I think, is what the role of the church is, to talk about life and death in terms of our relationship with God, not necessarily just as a biological function. So that's all I would say. And now we'll turn over to Father David to kind of give us his take.
Thank you, Father. I want to thank you for inviting me to be sort of the human face of all of this technical, scientific, and theological language. And so I also have to thank His Grace Demetrius, Chancellor of the Metropolis of Chicago, for, letting you know about my situation. And speaking of the Metropolis of Chicago, I want to publicly thank all my brothers from the Clergy Syndesmos here in Chicago. They've been tremendously supportive of our situation. And I just pray that any other priest who's going through something similar as we are, that they get half the support that we have gotten from our brother priests here in Chicago. And finally, I need to also thank St. Louis Children's Hospital, not only for taking care of my child, but for their approach to medicine. You can see I'm in a nice conference room here, and that's indicative of their attitude towards their patients and their families. Even though my daughter is being supported by cutting-edge technology, I mean, she's being supported by machines that have only recently been approved by the FDA, and this hospital was dealing with this technology even before the FDA was approving them. And so there's all this cutting-edge technology. They insist on putting the human person first. They play with my child every day, and they insist that the family is an integral part to the healing process. And it's very orthodox in their approach, and I want to, let everybody know that there is this wonderful resource here in the Midwest called St. Louis Children's Hospital that approaches medicine in a way that is alien really to the way we do things, because we often subsume ourselves to the technology around us. I want to begin by sharing with you one of my favorite icons. Do it real quick. Hopefully you'll see it. This is an icon of Saint Sisuis the Great. We celebrated him by the grace of God yesterday. And he's sitting here over the tomb of Alexander the Great, the king of the Greeks. And it says in the writing over here, the mere sight of you, tomb, dismays me and causes my heart to shed tears as I contemplate the debt we all men owe. How can I possibly stand it? O death, who can evade you? This has been my reality for almost 6 years now. When my daughter first got diagnosed with heart disease. Because, we live with the reality of the moment that we're conceived, we're in the process of dying, and every one of us will die. And in that icon, you see two men who have experienced death, Sisuis and Alexander. But when my daughter was diagnosed with heart disease, that reality of her death became acute. I've been preparing for her death and for the reality that I might have to do her funeral for 6 years now, ever since she was diagnosed at 9 months. And today, speaking of cutting edge technology and being kept alive by machines, she's closer to death today than she has ever been in her short life, because you turn off the ventilator, you turn off her VADs, which are vascular assist devices, and she dies. So when I'm at her bedside, I am staring directly into the face of death. And so from my own perspective and my own, what do I do in this situation? Pray, obviously. But then you run into the conundrum of, well, what am I praying for? If we take a look at the traditional prayers for healing, Jesus Christ, physician of our souls and body, lift it from this bed of sickness, suffering, and wasting disease and perfectly restore her to health. Now, on the one hand, I understand that really the only way that is going to happen is with the second coming. That perfect health is only going to happen in the resurrection. However, in a practical sense, in the here and the now, and in this fallen world, it's easy for me, having come from a human secularist background, to be cynical about this and accuse my own self of asking for God to kill somebody in order to save my daughter. Because, as we've been talking about, you take a heart out of somebody, that's it. So when I say that prayer, am I asking for someone else to die? And if I am, why am I asking that? Because I've lost a child. I don't want anybody else to go through that tragedy. Which brings me to the point of the whole issue of transplantation. Because there was a time in this 6-year journey between when my daughter was first diagnosed and now, where my wife and I would have said no to an organ transplant. We would have just not let the machines even be turned on and just let the natural course of events happen, because when we stare into death as Orthodox Christians, one of our jobs is to be defiant and to know that Christ will come again and that there is a resurrection and that, we should not be afraid of death. But then as we have gone forward in this process, we have come to realize that, tragedy is a reality for all of us. Every single one of us will experience tragedy if we haven't already experienced tragedy. And one of the things that Christ does is that he tells us to pick up our cross and follow him. In other words, our path through tragedy and through sin and through death is the cross. And he, as you know, personally experienced in an intimate way the greatest tragedy in all of human history. The Logos, the second person of the Trinity, through whom all things were made, crucified. And this tragedy he then turns into resurrection. And we have seen in our daughter over the past 6 years the fact that her suffering, and she has suffered tremendously, has resulted in a way for God to bring glory through her in the same way that he brought glory to himself through the man born blind. The amount of research and information that the doctors here at St. Louis have learned from her experience is tremendous. I mean, right now, her devices that they're using to sustain her are being used in a way they've never been used before, because they've never had to deal with a patient with her particular needs. And so therefore, every day that she lives, every day that she suffers, something new is being learned. And through her suffering, someone else won't have to, because of the things they're learning from her. And so then you have to start thinking about, well, if my daughter is providing this blessing, that God is using her in this way, what about that family who loses a child? Not that God wants someone to die. Obviously, he doesn't. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone to the cross. Not that I want anybody to die. Every single time. I mean, the reality of the Lord's Prayer, and when we ask, "Thy kingdom come," it is my greatest desire that it comes now, so that no child has to die, that my child might live. But in his wisdom, if the second coming is not going to happen in my lifetime, there will be a family who will lose a child, and that child's heart may very well be a good fit for my daughter and might provide my daughter a chance to live a full and life continuing to bring glory to God. And should that happen, that affords that family and that child who has died an opportunity to experience Christ on the cross in a way that no one can provide anybody. I mean, this child who has died will give out of death life. That there will be this opportunity for this family to see their child's death mean something. That their child, in some small way, as we see with Athanasius the Great, his description of the heart being the seat of the soul, one of the seats of the soul. And so in part, that child's soul will be in my daughter and will live on through her. That through the process of taking communion, that my daughter will be giving communion to part of this child for the rest of her life. This is the process this is what goes through my head when I'm sitting at the bedside of my daughter and praying. that I'm praying for God to transform tragedy into blessings, because tragedy is. It is what it is, as we say on this floor all the time. There will be death. But through the process of all of these fantastic medical advances, we have an opportunity to allow God to work through this tragedy, through this suffering, and through death to bring life. I'm just grateful that I get to witness on a daily basis the way that God works through my daughter and her suffering, because that's how you get through this. If you focus on her suffering and you still focus on how much she's in pain, it's unbearable. But if you see the fact that God is shining forth through her and teaching all of us about how transformative suffering can be. Can you still hear me? Is it still working?
Yeah, now we can see.
I can hear you.
Okay. This is how I get through every day, living here at the hospital, seeing my daughter do these things, go through these things. And it's how we as a family get through. We know that we are witnessing the work of God. We are witnessing someone picking up their cross. And that's all we can do, is pick up ours and follow, because her cross is much greater than mine. And all I can do is be at the bedside and love her and help her in any way that I can. Other than that, all I can do is there any questions that you might have for me and what I'm going through?
Thank you, Father David. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. What we're going to do, one second, just so that both Father David and Gail can see everyone who's asking the question, if you could make a line over here and you'll ask the question to them in the camera, okay, so that they can see who you are, and everyone else can already see you. So anyone who has a question can come up again this way.
This way?
Yeah,
Okay.
please show your name.
My name is Juanita, and I have to tell you that we just went through this with my great niece, who was 15 months old when she had her heart transplant. And right now you are witnessing miracles, whether you believe it or not, whether you can see it or not. There is a miracle every day that child is still alive and waiting for her heart to come. And my question was, what's your daughter's name so we can pray for her?
Father, did you hear that?
Mildred.
What was that?
Mildred.
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 Mildred. Okay. Anyone else? Father, come on up. Again, don't be embarrassed. Just try to keep this balance.
Okay. Hi, Father David.
And Gail, you can
Hi, Gail. Actually, my question is for you, Gail.
Sure.
I had a friend, actually he's still a friend, whose job was to harvest eyes. And he shared with me stories, now this was several years ago, how he would get calls in the middle of the night to accident scenes where the license indicated donors. My question for you, and this helps us as priests and as families on a pastoral side of things, when we talk about the respect of the donor and the respect of the human body. He shared with me some horrible stories of almost in his description, vultures descending upon car accidents. What is the current trend in improving that situation so we can maintain that respect for the human body and still offer the life-saving opportunities for organ donation?
Yeah, so I mean, so I wish I could answer it well, but I'll do my best. I mean, probably the best example I can give you is a personal one. My cousin just lost his son, 22 years old, in a car accident in Ohio, and the family decided to donate 5 of his organs. And they said that my cousin David said his son Greg, they kept the body alive for a little bit of time, but they were constantly talking with the family, meeting with the family. They brought in counselors to talk to the family, pray with the family. And my cousin David said that it was really hard for him to lose his son at age 22, but that the way it was handled by the hospital and by the staff was so comforting to him that it really helped. And then the other thing that's happened, I think, in recent years, this has been really good in the past few years, is there's a lot of follow-up that's going on from the organizations that are responsible for this, where they're actually keeping in touch with the families that have lost loved ones who have donated organs, and they're telling them, look, this is where this child is now, where the organ has been was donated. And there's so much touch between the family and the donor family that I think it's becoming a very, very humanized situation. When I was doing kidney transplant work at 2 a.m, much the same as your friend a few years ago, probably about 10, 15 years ago, I would say that it was not nearly as human as it's become now. And people seem to have realized that this was very important, that this respect was important, and that the human contact was important. So I know that it varies from state to state, but certainly in the state of Ohio, where I grew up and where my cousin just handled this, I think it's really changed and become something almost beautiful instead of something very ugly and dehumanizing.
I'd like to answer the question a little bit as well, because there's one of the guys here at St. Louis Children's Hospital who's in charge of getting organs and promoting organ donations, lost a child himself and made the decision to donate those organs from his child so that others might live. And he went on to actually become active in the process of getting donations because of that experience. So for him, it's been transformative and very positive from both sides of the equation, as someone who had to go through the decision to make those donations, and then as someone who is actually going out and assessing and getting those organs to give to people.
One more question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Hello, Father David, a quick question. Is your daughter on a waiting list?
Yes, she is currently on the waiting list. And the way the waiting list works is that the process first is geographic. As Gail mentioned, she would be, even if she was higher on a list, but the organ that became available was in California, she likely would not get it because of the distance. You have an area of about 500 square miles, and all of the potential candidates within that 500 miles are the ones that are considered to be at the top, regardless of where they are on the national list. And then from there, you have certain criteria as to who is higher. For example, my daughter is higher than your average potential recipient because she's on a BIVAD system, and those candidates are in greater need for a heart than someone who needs a transplant but can have their heart function on drugs alone. So those are sort of the brief overview of the criteria of how that list works.
Any other questions? Very no. Anyone else? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother David. Thank you, Gail. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for coming in and learning. I know the Clergy Laity Congress's theme is the family, the Christian family, and we wanted to, find a different way of approaching this topic. And I think we learned that we're all one family, biologically as well as spiritually, and to pray for each other. Let's keep Mildred in our prayers, and Father, you and your entire family are in our prayers, and please keep us in yours. And Gail, you're in our prayers as well. Thank you.
Father.
Thanks.
Thank you.